Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. I'm really very excited to get to talk to everyone, get to hear what you're interested in asking about and exploring in the book. And thank you, Gregory, for being here to talk with me too. You know that I love you. You know that I'm one of your biggest fans. So thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my delight. Thanks for having me. The love is mutual, Bridget. The love is mutual.
So as a reader, Greg, of the book, I'm wondering if you can speak to what some of your favorite parts of the book, some highlights, things that really stood out to you that you took away from it.
Yeah, so I remember one of my first impressions when I was reading the book was that there were so many aspects of the ways that the Christian church, especially in the Western world, interacts with the LGBTQ conversation that feel to us so natural. Like they feel so intrinsic, and it's like, of course, it's been this way since the dawn of time. How could we ever question it? And I love, I think. Heavy Burdens does such a nice job of sort of denaturalizing and then historicizing some of those things to say, like, this is not inherent, this is not intrinsic, it hasn't always been this way. Let me talk to you about ways that it has been otherwise in the past. And I just think that's so valuable as we seek to have healthy conversation about where we can move and to make our thinking healthier and more Christ-like and more productive. To not just take our assumptions for granted, but to really pull them apart and then kind of say from scratch, where do we build from here? Which part of these not natural assumptions do we want to keep? Which parts do we actually think are good? And which parts do we need to kind of tear apart and move away from? And so, yeah, I thought, I mean, right off the bat, for those of you who haven't read this book, which obviously you should, you know, and the fact that you're here is a good sign because it indicates that you know that you should. Yeah, that's the one. This one here, you should read it. But I think you'll get the feel for this as a reader right away. So burden number one. I mean, yeah, the book goes through these 7 different burdens, and for me, burden number one was just like such a strong start into this kind of denaturalizing. I love the way that you talk about how Christians began to think that sex, like everybody needed sex. You needed sex in order to be a fulfilled human being. And then it was like, well, okay, straight people need sex, but the gay people don't need sex. No. But it's so interesting to remember that our current assumptions about kind of the intrinsic human need for sex are something that we introduced somewhat later into the conversation. And I'd be curious, Bridget, I mean, I'm wondering like where you first ran across that idea. And like, I'd be curious too, like, as you were putting together the burdens, you know, these 7 burdens that you write about, were there ones that you were like, oh, I've got to start here. I know I'm going to write about this one, but I haven't decided about this other one. Like, how did you come to some of these ideas that you decided to sort of tease apart and historicize for us?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, because when I first got the idea to write this book, I knew immediately that I wanted to start with the history of the Protestant approach to thinking about sexuality. Because for me, I found that to be the single most frustrating part of conversations that I would try to have with fellow believers. And a big thing was I try to talk about the double standard of how so many Christians think about things like divorce, think about things like getting remarried, contraception, things like that were just seen as normal things to so many. And I would point out the double standard there in treating these things as normal questions to think about, but then treat homosexuality and same-sex marriage as this pariah over here. Yeah. And what I found to be most frustrating is that people would look at me like I had two heads when I would compare the question of divorce and remarriage to the question of same-sex marriage. They'd be like, what do you mean? Those aren't related at all. How are those related? And I'd be like, of course they're related. And they would just be completely baffled by the idea. And I realized that part of the reason why was that there wasn't an appreciation of how Christians got to where we are today in thinking about these questions, and in considering the ways that the definition of marriage has been redefined and redefined and redefined over the years. Yeah. There's this idea that redefining marriage is a new thing that happened with the sexual revolution in the 1960s. And in fact, the process of redefining marriage began 500 years ago. And redefining marriage has been very much a main ingredient in Protestantism from the get-go. And so that's why, I call chapter 1 the Protestant Sexual Revolution, because I really think that we can understand the Reformation as not just a reformation in terms of how we think theologically about a number of different major questions when it comes to Christian theology, but also how we think sexually. And in many ways, it was the first sexual revolution, not the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And so that's what I walk through in the book. And that's what I find to be like the starting point, in a way, for where we need to begin in order to get to where we need to go. And by the way, I need to mention to everyone, because I forgot to mention this at the start, we're going to be really focusing on questions during this webinar, because I find that to be what's usually the most interesting part of webinars is when people get to ask their questions and we can dig in to what people are thinking about. So Greg and I are going to be quickly pivoting to discuss the questions that you have. And so please put into the Q&A in the chat whatever questions that you have, either regarding the book or other questions that are on your mind related to LGBTQ issues in the church. And don't be shy, because I think that is the most interesting part, is digging into it together with what we're thinking through. But all that to say, yes, here. But all that to say, getting back to what we were talking about, I think that when it comes to understanding LGBTQ discrimination, you got to start at the beginning. And my book was really focused on looking at the history of discrimination in the Protestant church. I didn't, go into discrimination as much in the Roman Catholic Church, though I do discuss it to some extent. I don't discuss the whole story. I really was looking to get to the bottom of Protestantism and how we think about sexuality in Protestantism. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can I tell a side story? And then I have another question I want to ask you before we answer other people's questions, if I may. But a side story that reminds me of what you were talking about. Recently, I mentioned in passing somewhere, some interview I was giving, that I have a fairly conservative, if you will, view about remarriage after divorce. Which, I mean, my sexual ethics in general are fairly conservative, on a variety of levels. And so I mentioned this, and somebody reached out to me and they were like, actually, like, I heard you say that thing about remarriage after divorce. And they were like, let me send you a video that's so persuasive. It's going to, it's going to change your mind and you'll have like a much wider latitude. So I checked out the video. I watched it. It was very long. And I watched it and I wrote them back and I was like, if I took that kind of loosey-goosey approach to the Bible with remarriage after divorce, like, why would I not take the same approach with questions around same-sex marriage? Why would I not take the same approach with a whole host of other questions? And it was interesting to see, just how normal it felt to read scripture with this very accommodating perspective and say like, well, yeah, the Bible seems to literally say that, but like, let's think about the human implications. When we were talking about straight people, when we were talking about straight remarriage after divorce, but it didn't feel natural to make the same kind of, well, let's think about the human, let's think about accommodations in thinking about same-sex marriage. And it was just such an interesting moment for me personally of seeing like, we are having two very different conversations right now. Yeah. I'm curious, as you were sort of leaning into this, this like historical look, especially into Protestantism, like you said, and kind of getting information about what has brought us into our current moment, was there stuff you found that particularly like surprised or shocked you? Because certainly you knew things going in. I mean, it's hard to be gay in the 21st century West and not like feel some of this intrinsically already. But what was stuff that you discovered that was like shocking to you?
I definitely had some things that I discovered in the course of writing this book. And the biggest one was relating to the definition of sodomy. In fact, during the course of my research, it really just like threw me when I discovered that for most of Christian history, sodomy was understood as a sin that primarily heterosexual people committed. It was not understood through a lens of like, oh, the homosexuals do that. In fact, sodomy was considered something that most commonly took place in what we would consider to be heterosexual sex. That was absolutely surprising. And the reason why sodomy for most of Christian history was understood that way was because Christians historically, up until just recently, believed that the purpose of sex was for procreation, was for having children. And so what was sodomy? Sodomy was when you had sex and intentionally subverted the procreative capacity of that sexual intercourse. And so Christians all the way up to really the 19th century had that understanding of sodomy, that any subversion of the procreative capacity of sex was a sodomitic sin. And it was just absolutely fascinating reading some of these early texts where different leading Christian thinkers and voices throughout Christian history were discussing Romans 1:27. Romans 1:27 is a verse that is very commonly used to condemn homosexuality today. And it's very, very common. I'll see Christians whip out Romans 1:27 and be like, well, what do you do with this verse? You know, homosexuality is unnatural. They turned against their natural inclinations and did something unnatural with each other. You know, there's a lot of things that we can say about Romans 1:27, but what I found absolutely astonishing was that the early Christian writers, through Martin Luther, John Calvin, understood Romans 1:27 not to be talking about same-sex intercourse, but rather non-procreative intercourse. And that was the turning away from what was natural to what was unnatural. And when you read some of the early Christian thinkers, they use Romans 1:27 explicitly to condemn married couples who use contraception. And, from Athanasius to St. Clementine, Romans 1:27 was considered to be an explicit condemnation of contraception. And so that's so ironic, because so many Christians that refer to Romans 1:27 and are like, what do you do with that, you homosexual? Those same Christians are wielding a verse that, if they turned it around to themselves, is, historically speaking, also condemning their own sexual behavior. And again, this speaks to what you said about how, interpreting scripture through a lens that understands the human angle and understands the needs of people, that is by and large accepted when we are applying scripture to straight people. But the minute you take it and apply it to gay people, all of a sudden it's literal. Like, the Bible says it, I believe it, it's done. But now that I'm observing Romans 1:27 has actually always applied to straight people too, everybody's like, oh, hold on, we got to be understanding. Yeah, maybe that was literal back then. It's like, what? Really? Okay, just a minute ago, you were saying that the homosexuals are going to hell because they disobeyed that verse. So what's going on here? So that was really fascinating for me to discover.
You know what else is so interesting to me about that reading of Romans 1? Is that, like, the whole point of Romans 1 is to set us up for Romans 2, which starts like, you therefore have no excuse, you who cast judgment on somebody else. Because, like, at whatever point you judge somebody else, you stand condemned because you do the very same things. And so that example of the different readings of the passage over time is such an interesting illustration of the way anytime you try to make Romans 1 like point a finger at somebody else and make you feel really good about yourself, it's like, watch out, because this is about to backfire on you.
Yes, exactly. I love that you are highlighting that, because that is exactly the point of Romans 1. I am going to pivot now to the questions that we've been getting in. I've got a lot of questions. Yes, I've got a lot of questions that I got in from the socials. And I encourage everybody that's listening and watching, please submit the questions that you have about the book or about other issues in the church related to LGBTQ issues. And we will go ahead and we'll tackle some of that together. So the first question that I wanted to start with is one that I actually think is a great segue from what you and I have been talking about, Greg. The question is affirming theology new, historically speaking, and is tradition important? So is affirming theology new, historically speaking, and is tradition important? So that's the question. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I have opinions about everything, for better or worse. Well, for one thing, I think it's useful when we talk about history to recognize that, like, we don't have all of history documented. Like, we have written down history documented. We have the people who had access to the writing materials and the people who were important enough to have their writings preserved. We don't have the words that people spoke aloud that either never got written down or got written down and didn't make it to us. So I just always think we should start our conversation about like the historical narrative with the epistemic humility of recognizing like there's a lot of history that we can't see and will never see because it's not there anymore for us to have access to. Having said that, I mean, my understanding is that certainly as far as the idea of making a theological case for a same-sex marriage, that seems to me to be a relatively new theological phenomenon. I mean, compared to 2 millennia of history, which I don't think that fact inherently answers the question. But I do think it's a relevant consideration to say what shifted in the world. What shifted in the world to make it possible for us to have the conversations that we're now having? And when we recognize that shift, how does that predispose us to understand the conversations that we're now having, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think what you said speaks perfectly to what I was really hoping to do with my book, was kind of framing the whole discussion so that we can understand these developments. And to answer the question, is affirming theology new, historically speaking? I think without a doubt, the answer is yes. But I also want to point out, and I hope that this is a takeaway that people have from my book, that how we talk about our theology of sex and marriage is overwhelmingly new across the board, historically speaking. And so everybody wants to talk about how affirming theology is new. It's never been, we've never talked this way before. Well, in general, historically speaking, we've never talked about sex and marriage the way we talk about it in general ever before, whether we're talking about same-sex marriage or opposite-sex marriage. And that's something that I think is important to step back and appreciate, because it's not the gays that are redefining marriage. It's us, it's all of us. And in fact, it was really a number of events that predated same-sex marriage that really just related to how we think about opposite-sex marriage that that predated and came first in terms of redefining things. And so it's not just the gays, it's everyone. And that's important to recognize. And the second part of the question was, is tradition important? And I mean, yes and no. I think that tradition is important in many ways, but it shouldn't be blindly followed. I do think that that was a positive development with the Protestant Reformation, was a recognition that, just because something is the way we've always done it does not necessarily make it right. But at the same time, there might be a reason why it was always done this way before. So I don't think it should just be, thrown out willy-nilly. But I do think that to a certain extent, we have to recognize that it's not this, it's not this thing that is on a pedestal that we can't ever question.
Yeah. I
All
love...
right, let's see. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'll just add briefly to that while you're finding the next question.
Yeah.
Just the idea that there's such value in when we're doing this denaturalizing and historicizing work, right? That doesn't necessarily mean everything we denaturalize and historicize needs to change or needs to change in a particular direction. And we can even recognize the value of doing that sort of like deep nuancing work and reach different conclusions ultimately about exactly where we should go. Like, I would guess that Bridget and I don't have identical views about like exactly everything that we should do in the future. But we can still share like, hey, there's a lot of value, there's a lot of importance in us just beginning by asking the question, right? So to say like, this is tradition and we need to ask why it's tradition doesn't answer the question like, here's what we do with it. But it's a great place to begin the conversation. It's not a conversation ender, but it's a great conversation starter.
I totally agree. I think that you're right on the money with that. I think it's where you begin, which is why I love that this is a question that came in so early, but like ultimately it's a springboard to get further in discussions. And this is actually a great segue. You're talking about agreements and disagreements and things like that. And people just by and large are not going to see eye to eye on most things. And that's not a bad thing. That's kind of natural to, you know, what it means to be figuring out this thing called life one day at a time. So the question that came in is from Jan. And the question is, I have come to the conclusion that same-sex marriage is not supported biblically. How do I have truly loving relationships with those taking another view? How do I disagree and still love well? So basically what I'm hearing is that Jan has come to a more historical understanding of marriage and sexuality, and is trying to figure out how to have that belief, essentially disagree with those that come to an affirming stance, but still do so in a respectful way, in a loving way, without offending people, without hurting people. So I'll take a stab at this, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts, Greg. I think when it comes to, for those of us who have come to a more conservative stance on marriage and sexuality, and I consider myself among them as someone who is celibate, I think it's important to first recognize that that position has been wielded to do so much harm, often irreparable harm to people who are made in the image of God. And so if you don't start from a place of understanding that, then I don't think that you're going to, I think you're already like off the tracks. You're already headed in the wrong direction, because I think it's a situation where the minute that you say that you believe this about marriage, that in a lot of ways is a trigger for someone for immense trauma that they have experienced in their past. And there's reasons for that, which, I mean, there's story after story in my book that goes into that. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. And after that, I think it's important to hold that view loosely. Don't hold that view from this perspective of, this is my belief. I searched the scriptures and I came to this conclusion, and it is the only possible conclusion that a good Christian can come to. I don't think that that is a helpful way of looking at it. Instead, I think that it's important to recognize that even though you came to a more conservative understanding of marriage and sexuality, that is one perspective among many that intelligent Christians hold, that Christians who are seeking God in the same way that you are, nevertheless came to a different conclusion on. And so I think it's important to have some humility in holding that perspective and recognize that a good and faithful Christian can think differently and still be as good and faithful of a Christian as you are. That this does not mean that this does not make them somehow less in the church, in the eyes of God, that both of you deserve to be affirmed as having equal standing in the church and in the eyes of God, regardless of who's right and who's wrong. I think we're all going to find out that we were right and wrong about a whole lot of things. And I think that the things that we were wrong about are going to be more than the things that we were right about. And that's why we have the grace of Jesus, ultimately, because at the end of the day, we are trying to figure out how to understand the Bible one day at a time with the help of the Holy Spirit. And my best at trying to do that is really, at the end of the day, no better than the next person's. And we are all depending on the grace of Jesus Christ when we get to heaven. So that's kind of how I think about it. But Greg, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I think my approach is in some ways different and in some ways really similar. And for me, it starts with the recognition that I think we often have an overinflated sense of our own importance in other people's journeys. That we often think it's part of our job to waltz around weighing in on whether somebody else is okay with Jesus or not. And it seems to me that the invitation of Scripture is to invite others into Jesus, and yet when we're doing the weighing of like, am I okay with Jesus or not, to have ourselves be the person whose sin we are most attuned to have ourselves be the person who we're constantly seeking to see more and more reformed into the image of Jesus first. And so when it comes to the question of whether or not someone else's view is valid or whether or not they're allowed to hold it, right? Whether or not an issue is something we can agree to disagree on, I guess I want to reject just categorically reject the idea of agree to disagree categories, because it assumes that I have some power to decide whether or not somebody else is allowed to disagree with me. It assumes that I'm supposed to put myself in the role of saying to someone else, oh, you can hold that view in disagreement with me. That's okay, but you're not allowed to disagree with me in this other way. When the reality is people already do disagree with me, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't get to decide whether they disagree with me. All I get to decide is how I can live in relation to them in the midst of our disagreement. And so I wonder if in our obsession to constantly categorize people and say, well, these people are in and these people are out, I've missed the point entirely. I sometimes think of the way Jesus talks about the sorting of souls at the end of things, right? Like in the Gospel of Matthew, there's the moment in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, like, many will say to me, like, Lord, Lord, didn't we, do all these things? We cast out demons. And he says, I never knew you. And then later in the same gospel, we have, I think it's like chapter 25, maybe, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus is sorting people and saying, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, etc. And then saying to others, I was hungry and you didn't give me anything. And in both of these stories, right, the Sermon on the Mount moment and also the sheep and the goats parable, there's this element of surprise. There are people who are like, Jesus, we have no memory of this moment happening. Or like, Jesus, we were so convinced we were going to get in. And it's as if Jesus is saying to people, like, you spent your lives living as if you could create a really convenient checklist and decide exactly who was in and who was out of grace. And the very project of creating the checklist indicates that you missed the point of the kingdom of heaven. And so I think anytime we try to categorize issues like this and say, these disagreements are okay, these disagreements are not okay, maybe we've missed the opportunity to say to all of us, like, let's seek to live more like kingdom people. Let's all recognize the possibility that we could be wrong. Let's all call one another toward a yet deeper discipleship, a willingness to give up more for Jesus. Like, if we could have that posture and be less interested in codifying people into in and out camps, it seems like we would maybe be better situated to follow Jesus.
Amen. I love that so much. This is why I invited you to have this conversation, Greg, because I knew that you were going to have incredible things to say. Yes. Yes. Amen to everything you just said. And I hope that we can get there. I hope that we can arrive at that place. I think that we do get there sometimes. And I want to see those sometimes become more of the time. Slowly but surely. So the next question I'm going to take from the socials. This person says, if a church has affirming and non-affirming members, can queer people feel safe? How does that work? There's no affirming churches around me. Should I stay at my church as a queer person? So this person is a queer person, and they are facing the question of should they stay or should they go when it comes to their church. And their church has a mix of affirming and non-affirming. So should they stay or should they go? Can that church be a safe place? How does that work? I'm going to let you share your thoughts first, Greg. And
perfect.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give the rough outline, and then you can polish it up, Bridget. The things that come to mind for me, I mean, certainly I think it's possible. I, for instance, right now I'm in a church community that has a mix of people who hold different views on sexual ethics, not just around same-sex sexual ethics, but again, other sexual ethics questions. We also hold some different views on them. And one thing that has made that work, at least so far in our church context, is that we have very intentionally as a church articulated, hey, here's where we are as a church community. Here's what we do and don't practice. Here's the kind of latitude and openness that we want to create for people who don't hold the church's view on all of these questions. So I think it's possible for the mixture to exist, but I think if the mixture exists in a way that is not clearly articulated, in a way that just sort of happens by accident, that seems to me like a catastrophe waiting to happen. So I would be very cautious of those spaces. But if it's a space that has articulated the way it intends to hold space, whether it's by offering some kind of third way approach, or in the case of my church, articulating, hey, here's the church's view, and yet here's the kind of honor that we want to show to people who are not in the same place as the church is on these questions. So that I think is really important. And then the other thing I'll say before I turn it over to Bridget to give you the really good stuff, the other thing I'll say is that when it comes to the question of whether a specific small church expression, right, not the church writ large, but a specific small church expression is a good place to stay, one of the best guiding principles I've found is the question, is this a place where I can actually, where I can serve, where I can live out my calling in a way that both does the things I am called to do and sort of contributes to the life of the church. If me living out my calling turns out to be at odds with where the church is going, such that I either have to stuff my calling in order to let the church do its thing, or I do my calling to the detriment of the church, I think when we reach that point of division, then it's best, for the sake of unity, it's actually best for us to separate and find a different, smaller church expression. Because, yeah, we don't want to put ourselves in a place where us following Jesus in our own calling is detracting from the community around us. So that's one sort of guiding principle I've found helpful in discerning, like, should I stay and try to make things better here, or do I need to go and find somewhere else?
Yeah, and I'm gonna just piggyback on that. I don't really have any disagreements with that, or majorly different things to say beyond pointing out that when it comes to this question, sometimes it's okay to shake the dust off the sandals of your feet, so to speak. Maybe you feel like this is the place for you, this is your church family, and you really, really want to make it work. But if you are not growing spiritually, if you are not being supported to grow in your faith with Jesus Christ, then that church is just not going to be a healthy place spiritually for you. And sometimes I think that we can be guilted into staying with a church for a variety of reasons, whether it's because, you know, what they say, no church is perfect, so you just gotta stick with it through thick or thin, or, you know, this is how the family of God works, or, you know, you don't want to be a church shopper. But at the end of the day, if you are not growing spiritually, if you are feeling oppressed spiritually in a church, then that's a place for you to leave. And I love what you brought up, Greg, about whether or not your callings in life coincide with where the church is going. And so this was actually something that came up just the other day. There was someone that was at a different event that I was attending who was in a church and loved the church a lot. The church was not affirming, but they enjoyed being there. They participated in leading worship there, and felt like they had a lot of friends, felt like they had a church family, but the church was not affirming. And so even though the church had a level of respect and honored all the church members in the different conclusions that they would come to on matters of marriage and sexuality, the church itself taught a more conservative stance. And as a result of that, anyone who was a minister at the church, who was an elder or a pastor, had to have that perspective, had to agree to that perspective and agree to teach that perspective. And so even though this person loved this church, they also felt called to ministry. And they had to make a decision. Is this a place where I can really pursue that calling that God has put on my life? Or am I eventually going to need to take a step forward to move on and find a place where I can really pursue God's calling on my life? And that doesn't need to be a negative thing. I think it was very clear that this person loved this church. And it doesn't need to be this, you know, terrible rending of your life in two because you left. Because we are all part of the body of Christ. We are all siblings, spiritual siblings together with Jesus. And so even if you move on from a church, that doesn't mean that those relationships need to go away. And to a large extent, this is something that I've really grown in thinking about, because it used to be in the past, I would tell people, if your church is not a place that is theologically in line, that believes XYZ about homosexuality, then you should leave. And I used to take a much harder stance when it comes to that, but more recently, I've been meeting a lot of queer people who have found homes in non-affirming churches, which seems so counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. And yet they find that, to your point, Greg, that God's calling on their life has led them to this place, and they're actually able to pursue that within the context of this church. And so I think, beyond asking yourself, what is this church's theology? I think it's better to ask, can I thrive in my walk with Jesus Christ in this church? Because I think answering that question is ultimately more important. And if the answer is no, then find somewhere else. If the answer is yes, then that might be a good place for you to settle down in. And that's your choice to make when it comes to that. I'm going to pull up the next question. Do you have any other additional thoughts, Greg, while I'm pulling that up?
No, I'll let you keep the last word on that one.
Okay. So let's see. So this next question is from, and I hope I am, okay, this next question is from Jessica. Jessica says, I read your book, Bridget, and appreciated it so much. I think it is so important for the church. One thing I wondered throughout as a heterosexual reader was just how exactly someone comes to understand themselves as gay. Excuse me, or perhaps a fundamental definition of what it means to be gay. If it is not, as you argue in the book, entirely reduced to sex, is it perhaps a strong desire for intimacy broadly with the same sex? Please forgive my ignorance with that question. I am really wanting to learn and understand, and would appreciate recommendations for any other resources. Okay, so to kind of summarize what this question is asking, it seems like Jessica is asking, what does it mean to be gay? How does someone come to understand themselves as gay? What is this concept, this category? So this is something that I talk about in my book, and it's something that I wish I could have talked about at greater length in my book, but there's never enough space. And I think that one important place to start when it comes to understanding what's to be gay is understanding that the word gay emerged to correct a lot of the stigma and pathology that had developed around Freudian psychology. And the vast majority of queer language serves to push back against stigma that exists in society. That is the function of the vast majority of language that is used within the queer community. The purpose is to look at the way society is stigmatizing a group of people, pathologizing a group of people, and push back against that, offer a way of thinking about this in a more humanizing way. And so when when the word gay developed, it was developed, in fact, to deprioritize the importance of sex, because the word homosexual really put the focus on sex. And gay people were like, no, like you can't you can't pathologize us as sexual perverts. That's not who we are. We are human beings. So first and foremost, when it comes to being gay, and coming to understand yourself as gay, along with that comes an understanding that you are a human being that is of equal value, equal worth as anybody else in the world, regardless of you being different, regardless of you experiencing your body differently than other people. And so that is a really important thing to understand. And in fact, queer itself was developed as a way to reclaim a word that had been a slur for so long. So when we think about gay, when we think about that category, it really is intended to focus on how people exist relationally in the world. So how do we exist as relational beings in the world? Well, there's a variety of ways that we relate to other people. Our sexuality just happens to be one, but we relate to other people in ways beyond our sexuality. When it comes to our physical bodies, we relate to each other through hugs and through rubbing shoulders against each other and handshakes. But even beyond our physical body, we relate emotionally with other people through our interests, through our intellect. We relate spiritually with other people. There's so many ways of interacting with others within society when it comes to relating to other people. And so when you think about the category of being gay, you have to understand you're not talking about a sexual category, you're talking about a relational category. That includes how we interact with the world sexually, but is not meant to be defined by that, which is why, and I bring this up in my book, which is why asexual people are gay. Not all asexual people are gay, but many are, and they talk about it that way. But they don't experience sexual attraction. It doesn't matter, because how they experience relationships is one in which they are drawn to people of the same sex. That doesn't have to be this sexually pathologized thing. You can be drawn to members of the same sex in a variety of different ways without defining it by sexual attraction alone. So hopefully all of that makes sense. And Greg, you can translate if it didn't.
I'll just hop in with a personal example that I think maybe illustrates some of what you're talking about, Bridget. So not too long ago, I was chatting with a couple of people, and one of them was the pastor of my church. And we were talking about a particular romantic comedy, and I was describing it to them because none of the rest of them had seen it. And so I sort of named the plot, and then I was like, yeah, and it stars Mark Ruffalo and one of the blonde women who's in a lot of rom-coms. And somehow they managed to figure out that the woman I was talking about was Reese Witherspoon. And so my pastor was like, it's very clear. He was like, Greg, that's like one of the gayest things I've ever heard you say. He was like, when Reese Witherspoon is in a movie, I know it. And it was just, it was like, and it wasn't that he was saying like, oh, and I'm like super sexually attracted to Reese Witherspoon, nor was I saying like, I'm super attracted to Mark Ruffalo. It was just that I was attuned to like, oh yeah, I happened to pay attention to like who the guy in the movie was. And the guy, and my pastor was like, oh, I happened to pay attention to who the woman in the movie was. And so there was a sort of a relational awareness that preceded, certainly preceded lust, even preceded something like sexual temptation or sexual attraction. It wasn't really sexual. It was pure awareness. And yet that pure awareness was in some way tied to the fact that I'm definitely not straight, and he definitely is. And so it was just a moment of recognizing, like, yeah, this is not about sex, and yet it is a way in which our perception of the world is markedly different from one another. And it's okay for us to be able to name that, and to name that in a way that helps us think through, like, how do I live this life well then? And if I'm a follower of Jesus, how do I live well as a follower of Jesus with the kind of experience, with the kind of perceptional awareness that I have? Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. And I think that so many people, at least in our day and age, have lost the ability to understand what draws them to another person through any other lens than sex. And that's largely because of how we've been taught to think about the world and ourselves and relationships within the church and without. And so we need to kind of dial that back and recognize that there is more to being drawn to another human being than just your sexuality. We are full human beings with a kaleidoscope of aspects of who we are. And all of those things are all tied up together in drawing us to some people and not others. And getting us to just click with this one person, whereas this other person we just don't click with. And that's not because either of us did anything wrong. It's just because we didn't click. And that's okay. That's normal. And is our sexuality often involved in that? Well, yes. Does it have to be? No. And regardless, at all times and in all places, there is a myriad of other stuff going on. And so you can't look at it through this one very, very tiny thing. You have to have a full picture. Okay, so we are pretty much out of time. I want to answer, it really does. I want to answer one last question because I think I can answer this pretty quickly. And I think it'll end us on a happy note. So, I just got rid of it by accident. Hold on. In your opinion, this is from an anonymous attendee. In your opinion, how do we, oh shoot, this wasn't the one. Oh gosh. Where, okay. I'm just going to summarize it because I can't find it. The question was, in effect, a lot of LGBTQ people have responded to the book very well, but what about straight people? What has their response been? And I would actually say that the response to the book from straight Christians has actually been overwhelmingly positive. I have not received a ton of negative feedback from straight believers. And I think part of that is just due to the way that the audience was targeted for this book, which was targeting people who are clearly invested in learning about this issue, clearly invested in growing when it comes to these questions. And regardless of where they are theologically, and the audience for this book is all over the place theologically. Yeah, queerly invested, someone said. But regardless of where people land, they are committed to understanding. And so I really give that credit to the people who are reading, to the people who follow my work and my writing, that there is a kind of collective commitment to growing, and also then recommending the book to people that are similarly interested in growing in those ways. And so that's been a really encouraging thing that I've seen. And it's been really great to see the book having such a positive impact across the board with whoever is reading it, whether they're on this side of the spectrum or that side. It's been really great to see the positive feedback coming from different people. Final thoughts, Greg.
Yeah, well, while we're on that subject, I'll just say, I think one of the many really helpful things about this book is how much it can speak to folks who are in different contexts, folks who are reaching different theological conclusions, folks who come to the conversation for different reasons. Again, that work that it does so well of sort of putting our current moment in context, the way you bring out stories from people and tell them so beautifully along the way. I just think it can offer a lot to a lot of us who are in very different positions, even as we reach different conclusions. There's wisdom to be had in having the conversation carefully. So I'm grateful to you for giving us this resource that helps us have a more careful conversation with each other about it.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Greg. And for everybody else, thank you for coming. If you've read the book, feel free to leave it a review wherever you bought it from. And if you haven't read it yet, I hope that you will find yourself a copy and give it a read. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about it when you finish. Overall, thank you for coming. I hope you have a good rest of the night, and God bless.